Hi, welcome back to Basement Bible Breakdown. I'm your host, Stephen Whitsitt. Glad you could be with us on this short podcast. And today we are talking about the second coming in a series here and presenting the argument against preterism from the beginning. In our last video, we talked about the idea that there is nothing recorded in history about a second coming. Nobody records that it happened. The Christians who were supposed to be living at that time never once ever said that Christ returned. Even if it was invisible coming, John said, "We shall see him as he is." They all look forward to it. And you would think that if the Christians are expecting him to come, there would have been at least one person who had said, "He came. The new heaven and earth are here." But we don't find any kind of such recorded in history about any of that. There's nobody who said anything about seeing Jesus or knowing that he came. And it would be absolutely ridiculous that if he had come back to complete the process of salvation for all Christians, spiritually, physically, or whatever way you want to describe it, then every Christian would have known that happened. But not one did. Not one person ever testified that Christ returned, that they were changed from mortal to immortal, from perishable to imperishable. No matter how you want to define the words, I'm not arguing that. It doesn't matter. There is no testimony from anybody that Christ came, that anybody was changed, or that anything was raised. None whatsoever. Right there, that alone defeats preterism. Because if you claim that something is going to happen, you claim that there was Christians there, that Christians fled to Pella, the Christians all fled from Jerusalem, then those Christians who are alive would have been able to sit there and say, "Hey, Christ returned, we saw it, we know it, we felt it," whatever way. They would have declared it from the rooftops, just as they all declared that Christ came the first time. But we don't have 1 ounce of that. That right there makes any kind of claim for something happening absolutely stupid. And it's just like the claim of H&B in Timothy. They were claiming that the resurrection was past. Well, no. Nobody was declaring it but what? Those two people. Out of all the churches and everything around there, you got two people saying the resurrection is past. And they weren't even talking about the second coming, were they? They were just saying, "Hey, the resurrection is past." And Paul said, "No, that's simply a lie. Not even going to deal with it. Pay attention to it." So the next logical argument that I want to deal with secondly, is I wanted to read that quote to you. This is from Barnabas that I mentioned before in the other video. He says, "And it so happened, through their going to war, it was destroyed by their enemies. And now they, as the servants of the enemies, shall rebuild it." Again, it was revealed that the city and the temple and the people of Israel were to be given up. For the scripture says, "And it shall come to pass in the last days that the Lord will deliver up the sheep of his pasture and their sheepfold and tower to destruction. And it so happened as the Lord has spoken." Okay, Barnabas is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. But then he says in just a few verses later, "When his son coming again shall destroy the time of the wicked man and judge the ungodly and change the sun and the moon and the stars, then shall he truly rest on the seventh day." Now this was written after 70 days, so you can see why Ed is invested in trying to prove this all happened before 70 AD, because if that's true, then it would make it future. But he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. It had to have been written after 70. All scholars agree that Barnabas was written after 70 and sometime before 100 AD, which means it's part of Barnabas' testimony while he wrote, while he was alive, and not a fake. Now, let me go back to a real simple point, too. Of course, when we talk about the book of Revelations covers the second coming and everything. Now, we know all about Gentry's book, Before Jerusalem Fell, his arguments all there. I've read it from cover to cover. I know his whole arguments, the internal and external. My first point, I would make about anything internal is subject to the person's interpretation. If the person is not sound in their hermeneutics and are out to prove something wrong that is true, or to prove something true that is wrong, you can make the Bible say anything you want to by those hermeneutics. It is proven not true by its being illogical, inconsistent, and incoherent. Now, what Gentry argues in his arguments are inconsistent and incoherent. And I'll basically state the argument here for you very, very, very simply. When we are talking about the quotes and things like this from external sources where they talked about it, the main argument, of course, comes from Irenaeus, where he talked about what was being seen. Was it John or was it the Antichrist that was being seen? But I have to point this out. First of all, understand that before we get to that quote, Irenaeus says twice, and I'll read the quote here for you. And all the elders that associated with John, the disciple of the Lord in Asia, bear witness that John delivered it to them, meaning the book of Revelation, for he remained among them until the time of John. So, what was it delivered it to them? In context, he's talking about the book of Revelations. John delivered the book of Revelations among the Asian brothers, and John was living and alive until the time of John. Now, Irenaeus is writing this at about 150 AD. John lived about the time of John, which would have been 98 to 100. In that time frame, right in through there, that Trajan was ruling as Roman ruler. So now we have it tied to Trajan and John being alive. So any statements and everything else, you have to prove why Irenaeus would be wrong, and we can't find any. Yes, people made mistakes. On historical things, no. On theological, yes. Do you see the distinction there? If John or somebody says that so-and-so lived at a certain time, and this person says it, and this person says it, and this person says it, okay, then we know that Nero lived from such and such time, and he died by his own hand in 68. Nobody's doubting those historical facts because they become historical. The same thing for the rule of Domitian, Trajan, or any other ruler. We know when they started, we know when it ended, and we're not arguing about that. Always within a year or two, we have those dates completely down. So here's Irenaeus, who was living within 50 years. Now get this. If he was about that old, that means he was born just about that time when John was dying, during the time of John. It would have been right in those years that he was born, and now here he is at about 50-year-old, writing at about 150, and is talking about some of the history, and he's talking about the heresies, he's talking about the book of Revelations, and he's talking about John, what John revealed, and specifically is talking about the Antichrist. So now we come up to the statement he says, "We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of the Antichrist. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision," which was, of course, John. It was John who saw it, right? "For that he was seen no very long time since, but almost in our day, towards the end of Domitian's reign." Okay, does that conflict a little bit with what Trajan, what he said twice about him living up to the time of Trajan? Yes. So he's living during the time of Trajan, or was it Domitian? There's, one after the other. It can't be talking about him because he's already established it was him. What is he establishing? The revelations. He knows he's already established that John was alive. Now he's sitting there arguing and proving that it was the revelation seen during the time of Domitian that he saw the vision. Now, how is that backed up? Well, Domitian died in 68. The common thing that we understand from Eusebius and other histories is that when a Caesar would come into town, any kind of political rivals and things like this, they would banish them to other places. And John, here being an enemy of the state, of course, was banished to the island of Patmos. And it would have been by Domitian, who did stir up a second persecution, according to Eusebius, but soon quickly abandoned it because he found out there was no substance to the rumors and the things that he was responding to. And Eusebius, of course, records all of these arguments and what's going on in Book 3. So getting back to this is, so if John has already been established to have lived up until the time of Trajan and through Domitian, he left the island of Patmos is when he wrote the book, because it says he was on the island of Patmos. He was sent there by Domitian. He was there and then would have been released after 68. So it was during that time that he would have saw the vision. During the reign of Domitian, he would have been on Patmos. So what? "For it was seen no very long time since, but almost in our day, towards the ends of Domitian's reign. That's what makes perfect sense. That is not a contradiction to the time of Trajan talking about him being seen, but now he is talking about when was the revelation seen by John. We can't get away from that argument because that is the basic argument that's been made by scholars for almost 2,000 years. Roman Catholic scholars, writers, and everything else have set that tradition down and have known it and said it and argued it. When was it questioned? Just recently. Why is it all questioned? Why is it so important that, excuse me, why is it so important that preterists say that the Bible was written before 70 AD? I think that's a no-brainer. It's because if Revelation was written after 70 AD, everything about the preterist system is completely bogus. Now, do you catch the power of that? Preterism cannot stand as viable in any way, shape, or form if Revelation was written after AD 70. That means nothing in it could have been fulfilled in AD 7. The second coming, the resurrection, the judgment, the new heavens and earth, all of that is afterwards. So the preterist has no choice but to try to prove it happened before, as do partial preterists. And that's where the screw up begins right there. Because in order to do that, you have to start lying about what the text says. You have to start lying about the witnesses said. You have to start lying about all of those things and discrediting them. Why is it so important to discredit all of this? I want you to get to this thought and understanding. Because there is no statement by anyone that says that Revelation was written before, during the time of Nero. Because here's where the fact would have been. If it was Nero that sent, and it would have to been because Nero started his reign back in the 50s, it would have had to been Nero that took John and sent him to the island. If it was Nero who sent him to it, then John would not have been released until after Nero was dead. Nero killed himself in 68. The Revelation is about things that are, the things that are to come, the things that are soon to happen in quickness. This is a prophecy and a warning to the Christians about what is going to happen. Now, if you're claiming all these events are about 70 AD, and the beast is supposed to rule for 42 months, subtract 42 from 70. The beast is supposed to rule what? Starting in 66. That's when he gains power. Nero didn't gain power in 66. In fact, you're sitting there arguing that John didn't write the book. And this is what Gentry does say at the end in his book, Before Jerusalem Fell, that the book was written about the time of 68 after he was freed from the island and came back. People, it doesn't line up. You can't sit there and write about something as a warning to people to flee or what the events are going to happen. What are the prophecies concerning them is going to happen concerning Christians all over the whole world and delivered to them a year and a half after all the things have already happened. It's like, hey, thanks for warning us about the beast. Oh, wait, he's already here. See, it doesn't make sense. That is illogical to claim. So it's defeated on that point, the early date, and you can't have anything earlier because it had to have been Nero that would have put John, and you can't ever have John being released before 68 until he had died. Sorry, that's historical facts that you're playing with and changing it, according to Tacitus and others who argue and have claimed and set that pattern that somebody would not have been released from that as a tradition of the Senate until after the ruler died. And as crazy as Nero was, I doubt that he would have ever put John on an island instead of killing him and having fun killing him as he did the others. So everything about that early date argument does not work. All right, well, thank you for listening. I'm hoping this will spark some discussions and things like this. So go ahead and subscribe. Go ahead and ask questions. But hopefully you'll do some of the research yourself and take a look at that. Of course, the works are to look at Clement, Ignatius, Barnabas. Those are all men who wrote after 70 AD. All right, until we see each other again next time, thanks for watching. Hope this wasn't too long for you, all right? All right.